Welcome to the channel. This is the first in a multi-part series where I'm going to work through all the tasks on CSSBattle, unedited and in real time. I'm going to explain all the CSS that I'm writing, all the properties, what they do, and tackle more advanced concepts as the problems get more difficult. So I'm expecting coming into this that you have some very basic knowledge of HTML and CSS, as I'm not going to be explaining the fundamental syntax or the context of the languages as part of this series. If that would be helpful, then let me know in the comments and I'll do a video just for that. If you find this video helpful, please consider subscribing, and if you have any ideas on how to make my content more useful for you, consider leaving a comment. So let's get started. This is the first battle, simply square. And so what we're looking at on the far right hand side is a kind of brown background with a kind of light blue turquoisey square up in the, or rectangle up in the top left. So that's what we're looking at here, and in CSSBattle you can kind of hover over this part in the middle and directly compare the two sides. So CSSBattle ranks you based on how accurate you are and how much code you write. I'm going to ignore the part about how much code you write. I'm going to write code as if this is a real production environment and the kind of code that I would write on a real project. So in here, this is wrapped in an implicit kind of body tag, and I can show you that because if I write some CSS in here, I can change the background, for example. So this is the body in here. And so the body by default has some padding on it. So if I set the padding to be 0, the margin to be 0, sorry, I meant to say margin, not padding, it's got default margin in here, so there we go. I've just set the margin to 0, and that's how we've moved it into the corner. So the padding you can think of as adding some space to the inside of the boundary of your object and the margin to the outside. The main difference being that margins can overlap, so if you have two elements and you say that they have to have a 40 pixel margin each, then they're going to be 40 pixels away from each other. Whereas if you have two objects next to each other with a padding of 40, then each boundary will have 40 pixels inside it. And then the boundaries touch, so there'll actually be 80 pixels between the content. So that's worth bearing in mind. There are some exceptions to that based on positioning, but we'll get to that as we come to it. So we just need to get the margin down to 0, and that's how we get that box in the corner. And then we're going to set our background to be the right color. So in here we can just click on that and grab it, so we can do background and put that in here. You can also do background color if you want to be more specific about the type of background, or if you're using the background property for something else. So for example, you can set a background color and then override it with a background image, which will lie over the top, so you get a kind of background in the meantime. So there we go, we've got our background color in. Now we need the square, so let's grab this. And seeing as we only have one box to do, I'm happy to just leave this as a div. So we're targeting this up here. This is the other bit of HTML, so we can actually edit this to edit the HTML in here. And then we're just going to line these up, so just eyeballing it. Looks sort of around 200 by 200. Yeah, there we go. And there we are. So that's how you do the first one. And let's submit that and see what we get. Okay, and we've got a 100% match. So that's the first one. Let's move on. Okay, so now we are on Carom. Let me refresh this, can I go? No. So Carom. So now we have 4 little squares that we have to put in place on a purple background. So first things first, let's grab our color and put it in the background here. So that matches nicely. Now we're going to need our 4 squares. So for this I'm going to have 4 elements to represent each of these. So I'm actually just going to copy and paste these. So we got our 4 divs. Now I'm going to give them each a class of square. And so the first square we're going to do is the top left one. square top left, square bottom left, square top right, square bottom right. So this is getting a little bit more specific than what we had before, because we're using classes instead of just divs, so this is not relevant anymore. I'm going to put in our square. So I'm just going to eyeball this for now. They're probably 40 by 40, maybe a bit bigger, 50-50. Okay, that might be wrong, but we can fix that later. I'm going to grab our color and put that in there. And so now what I'm trying to achieve by doing things this way is I'm going to use this class square to do the actual styling of the square, because that's all consistent and that's something that they share, so I can break that into one class. Then these two are going to share their left positioning, these two are going to share their right positioning, these ones are going to share their top positioning, and these ones are going to share their bottom positioning. And so because we've got those shared styles, it makes sense to break it out this way so that we can minimize that duplication of code. So we've seen the width and height, that's relatively straightforward, putting in the pixel height and width. There are some complexities around that with when you add padding and stuff, but that's for slightly later in the series. So the first interesting thing here is we're going to use position absolute. So what position absolute does is it takes the element that's applied to it and it kind of pulls it out of the flow of the document. And so if you see the default is relative, and these are sort of stacked one on top of each other, and that's why we get this long bar, and that's because it's in the flow of the document, which means that the position of one element directly affects the position of the next one. And often that's what you want, because you want sort of components. If you know the text increases in size in one part, you kind of want it to push everything down in the rest of the page. So that's quite a useful property, but in this case we want the absolute positioning, and that means that they can overlap with each other, they're not going to actually affect each other in the layout. We're just saying the absolute position with regard to the parent of where we want it to sit, and it's not relative to anything else. So how do we move these around then? Well, let's make our left class, and so our left is going to be something like what's that, 100 pixels maybe. Our right is going to be maybe right 100 pixels. We can come back and tweak all of these. Our top is going to be, let's say 50 pixels. And our bottom is going to be bottom 50 pixels. Okay, so probably overestimated these, so I'm just changing the positioning. And there we go, that looks pretty good to me. So what we've done here is we've got no duplication. Our code here is quite expressive because you can see immediately what it corresponds to, and that's a really big thing in any programming language, is being able to easily read and communicate your intent. So all of them are squares, 2 of them are on the top, 2 of them are on the bottom, and then we have 2 on the left and 2 on the right. And there we go. So in this case, because we're using position absolute, we can actually get rid of that. And submit. Okay, 100% match. Very nice. I think we have time for one more. Push buttons. Okay, cool. So here we've got a light blue background. Then what I'm seeing here is a kind of blue rectangle, and then we're laying this kind of light blue ring on top of it, which will obscure part of this rectangle. And because it's the same color as the background, we get a nice effect there. And then we've got, we'll get this inner blue circle kind of for free doing it that way. And then we need this yellow dot here in the middle. So let's tackle that. The way that I'm going to create this is we're going to have this outer box, and then I'm actually going to play with some pseudo elements to make these, which should be fun. Okay, so let's make this called looks a bit like an eye, so I'm going to call it an eye. Okay, and let's bin all of this as well. So first things first, let's make our eye come up in the right color so we can see what we're doing. Always a good first step. So we've got our background color for our eye, and then again eyeballing the dimensions as something like this. Let's change the background color as well while we're at it of the whole thing, so we get the nice right stuff. So maybe it looks something like that. And let's try doing positioning. So a great way to position stuff centrally without removing it from the flow is using Flexbox. If you haven't heard of Flexbox, we'll be using it probably quite a lot in this series. Basically, it's short for flexible box, and it provides a lot of positioning options, and will do a lot of clever stuff for you with regard to automatically sizing and arranging its children. So let's make our body a flex box, and the way we do that is by display flex. Then what we want to do is justify our content in the center, and so justify content is to do with the sort of left and right positioning, the lateral positioning of the content. So by putting that in the center, what we're going to do is, if we had multiple children, we're going to sort of cluster them in the middle. You can also do things like space between or space around and all these sorts of cool higher level positioning options, rather than explicitly having to do pixel sizes everywhere. So that's justify content, and then we're going to use align items, and we're going to center that as well. So the alignment is a vertical aligning, and it looks like that's pretty well set up there. So again, you have things like stretch to fill the whole height, or align at the start or align at the end, etc. For this case, we just want to align in the center. So this is a useful way to justify something inside something else to be in the middle. So there we go, we've got our box, or the beginnings of our eye, let's say. So a pseudo element is an element that doesn't actually exist in terms of being in the HTML, but nonetheless it's something that we can style. So the way that you might do this is by using the before and the after pseudo elements. So the these are sort of originally intended so you could put sort of quote marks on text and things like that dynamically without having to actually put quote marks inside the markup, for example. But it's sort of advanced to the point where you can do almost whatever you want with these, and they're a really useful trick, so we'll cover that now. So the first things first, to make these show up, you have to give them some sort of content, typically just blank. If they don't have any content, then they're not going to show, and again, that's for historical reasons, because of the quote marks and things. It's expected that it will have some sort of content inside this element. So that's that, and I'm going to make the background or the border of this. I'm going to say it's going to be 30 pixel width. I'm going to give it a color. And it's also going to be solid. Okay, so that's because this could be dashed and things like that. You don't always want a solid border the whole way around. This is again the width of the border, and then this is the color. And these, there is a certain order you're supposed to do them in, but because they're quite distinct types, I can figure it out. So that's that. We've got it up there. Let's make it position absolute again. So we're going to play with that. Position absolute. We go left 50 pixels. You'll notice it's actually still in the corner. If I do left 0, it's actually off to the left. And so this is a good example of how absolute positioning works. and how it determines what it's being positioned absolutely relative to. So in order to make sure that our absolute positioning is relative to our box, what we're going to do is apply the position relative attribute up here, and so that will position this absolutely relative to the parent here. Okay, so what else have we got to do with this? We've got to make it round. Border radius 100%, great trick for making a circle. You can actually bring this down and get some like interesting kind of rounded effects here. But yeah, we just want a full circle. I think anything above 50% will work, but I just go with 100. Okay, so let's scale this up now. So our width is going to be 200 pixels, and our height is also going to be 200 pixels. I think our border needs to be thicker, maybe 50, and then it looks like this circle, you know, just touches each side of these. So I'm going to be explicit about our sizing, and I'm going to say box sizing, border box. Actually, no, content box. Let's do that. So here what you just saw is you can either choose for the width and height to apply to the content, i.e. sort of inside the border and inside the padding and stuff, or to the external size, you know, to the boundary of the box that wraps it just before the margin. So border box is just outside the border, content box is inside all of that. So that's what we got. Our width and our height will now be just the internal part of here, and that means that what we want is 150 because that's how high this is. And so that'll give us a circle of the right size. So our top is going to be minus 50 pixels because our border thickness is 50 pixels, and that's what it naturally pushes off the top from. And then I think our left can be maybe 25. Cool, nice. That's that effect. For completeness, one thing I would do on here in a production environment is make sure that this circle can't kind of interfere with things outside of it, because that's sort of not what we would want. So I'm just going to add overflow hidden. And just to demonstrate the effect of what that does, if I make the background, you know, green, that's actually going to cut that off there. Whereas if I don't have this, you know, this is what's actually happening. We've got that overflow going on. And so it's nice and tidy to make sure that the visual boundaries of your elements actually correspond to how they're going to play with the rest of the elements on the page, so you don't get any sort of nasty surprises. It's always best for the code to do what you kind of assume it should do. So almost done now. We're just going to create this little yellow dot in the middle, and we're going to use a lot of the same tricks. So we've got our pseudo element with our content. We're going to say that the background color is yellow, our height is 50 pixels, our width is 50 pixels, our border radius is 100%. Okay, so that's what we got so far. Let's go position absolute. And there we go. So that's our dot up there, and now we just have to move it into the middle. So for this, I'm just going to do a fun trick that I like to do, which you should always keep up your sleeve, which is how to position something using absolute positioning in the center, which I could have used for this as well. So we saw how to do it with Flexbox, and here I'm going to show you another cool one. So if I go left 50 pixels and top as, left is 50% and top is 50%, that's going to put the top left of the circle right in the middle of the screen. Okay, and so we got this offset down here. And so what we can do is then use the transform attribute and translate our object. So these percentages are relative to the parent, but any percentages we use in here are relative to our actual element that's got this transform property. So if I move it back 50% in the x-axis and minus 50% in the y-axis, we've moved the top left to the center here, and then we've moved the middle to where the top left was, because we moved it over by half the width to get the left aligned, and then moved it up by half the height to get the top aligned. So then we have it. That looks well aligned to me, and we've explored some stuff there with positioning, pseudo elements, getting some really good stuff. So there we go, 100% match on that one. And I think that's all we've got time for today. So thank you very much for watching, and have a good evening.